I want to talk about Whoopi Goldberg because I got so many texts this week because she attacked me the week before.
Sure.
So everybody was like, oh, Bill, I get you're enjoying the karma. First of all, I'm going to talk about this at the end of my show next week, teaser. But there is no thing as karma, okay? Get over that. Whoopi attacks me on a regular basis. She says stupid on a regular basis. It just happened to coincide. But can I just say this? I had on last week Ira Glasser, former longtime head of the ACLU, talking about free speech. Whoopi Goldberg, who, by the way, I hope is still a friend, we can disagree with each other, should not be canceled or put off her show, as much as I totally disagree with her crazy statement. Free speech.
And there it is. That's the clip. The moment everything shifted. Bill Maher didn't just push back on Whoopi Goldberg. He voiced what many people have quietly thought for years. That she can make bold, controversial, even questionable claims and still be treated as if she's beyond real criticism. What makes this more striking is that Maher isn't calling for her removal. He's arguing the opposite. Keep her on air, let her speak, but don't act like flawed arguments become insightful just because they're delivered with confidence on a daytime platform. This clash goes beyond a simple TV feud. It taps into a broader style of political commentary that's come to dominate parts of mainstream liberal media. Loud certainty, moral grandstanding, and the subtle pressure to treat every issue as if there's only one acceptable viewpoint. Maher has been edging into the role of a critic of his own side for a while now. But by taking aim at The View, he's not just criticizing a show, he's highlighting a larger system. One that can elevate heated opinions into moral authority, then act surprised when audiences start tuning out. So if you're into sharp analysis, media critiques, and commentary that doesn't dodge uncomfortable truths, hit like, subscribe, and share your thoughts. Was Maher right to go this far, or did he cross a line? Now let's rewind to the comment that sparked all of this, because Maher didn't just wake up and decide to go after Whoopi. He was responding to a comparison that was almost guaranteed to ignite controversy the moment it hit the public.
What did you think of Whoopi Goldberg saying it's worse to be a black person in America today than a woman in Iran? You know, I see we were talking about the trans issue before, and the New York Times really has come over on that to the sort of the sensible, liberal, not crazy woke position. I think this is a great first step toward getting the Democrats back to sanity, and a second good step would be we got to do something about The View. I really believe that. I mean, could you just
it's huge in Iran, though.
That's a brutal setup because Bill Maher doesn't ease into it. He jumps straight from the question to the punchline, then widens it into a broader critique. And you can see why a claim like, black Americans have it worse than women in Iran, might land inside a studio bubble. It's dramatic, emotionally charged, and built for applause. But the moment it leaves that bubble, the tone shifts. People start asking the question that cuts through everything. Really? Because that's the core issue with outrage-driven television. Everything has to be amplified. Every argument gets framed in the most emotionally satisfying way for your side. And once that becomes the norm, any sense of proportion starts to disappear. Instead of comparing real conditions, people end up comparing feelings, vibes over facts. The nuance gets lost, and complex realities get flattened into talking points. That's where Maher shifts the ground. He pulls the conversation out of abstract language and back into real-world context. Real lives, real struggles, and measurable progress. And once you do that, the comparison doesn't just weaken, it starts to fall apart under its own weight.
Mention The View in Iran, all with the same head cover. You can't even tell which one is which.
My district in the great state of Texas is actually a white majority district that President Trump would have won by 25 points. As I said, I'm a direct descendant of a slave. My great-great-grandfather was born on a Rosedown plantation. I am literally being judged not by the color of my skin, but by the content of my character. That's the progress because, like, a lot of white people had to vote for me. A lot.
So wait,
I don't even ever want to hear Whoopi Goldberg's conversation about how it's worse to be black in America right now. That's a bit far. And my father, who's 75 years old, he was a man that was in the French quarters that had to go get a sandwich to the back door of the building. And his son is now a United States congressman in a white majority district in Texas as a Republican. That is America. That's America.
And that's exactly why Whoopi Goldberg's argument landed so poorly. Not because racism has disappeared, And not because America is flawless, but because most people can distinguish between an imperfect society and an openly repressive system. That's why Wesley Hunt's point resonates. It's not some polished, textbook version of history. It's lived experience. His father grew up in one version of America. He lives in another. That doesn't mean the problems are gone. It means denying real progress isn't honesty. It comes off as performance. And that's where the frustration comes from. There's a clear difference between criticizing a country and flattening reality so much that you erase the gains previous generations fought hard to achieve. When that happens, it doesn't honor history. It diminishes it. But this is where the conversation expands. Bill Maher isn't just responding to a single comment from Whoopi Goldberg. He's challenging a broader worldview. The idea that identity categories become the primary lens through which everything is interpreted. And once that lens dominates, nuance tends to disappear, replaced by rigid narratives that leave little room for complexity or disagreement.
Juneteenth. That's a Texas holiday. It began in Texas in Galveston. General
right?
Granger came
Texas.
and read the order number 3 that finally abolished slavery months after the war because the war took a time to get to Galveston. We celebrated that when I was a kid in Texas, but it becomes national a year or two ago, and Donald Trump doesn't want to celebrate that. To me, it's exactly what you're talking about. So it's that 600,000 people died so that we wouldn't enslave people anymore, and the fact that freedom won is a good thing, and we should honor that. That's what Juneteenth's about. And I don't know why President Trump doesn't want to honor that.
So I don't want it. I don't want Black History Month. I don't want all these days for it to make everybody feel special. I'm an 80s baby. Everybody's too sensitive anyway. We're all Americans anyway. This holiday
That's what Morgan Freeman said.
Morgan Freeman, said, I can't agree more with him.
Yeah, he said that to Mike Wallace. He said, I'm an American. Do you want to be called a Jew American, Mike?
No.
This is where the split really shows up. Honoring history matters. Remembering injustice matters. Acknowledging specific wrongs matters. But the argument coming from Bill Maher's side is that, at some point, remembrance started to morph into something else. More like branding. Commemoration turned into categorization, sorting people into narrower and narrower boxes. And once politics becomes an ongoing exercise in labeling and grouping, it gets harder to build any shared identity. That's why this debate keeps resurfacing. One side hears, "We're all Americans," and feels a sense of unity. The other hears it and worries that important parts of history are being softened or erased. That concern isn't baseless. But Maher's position is that you don't have to choose between the two. You can preserve historical truth without making division the central framework for everything. And that idea isn't fringe. It resonates with a lot of people who feel caught between extremes. Then the tone shifts. The conversation gets lighter, more comedic, but also more revealing. Because underneath the humor is a real tension. How much of modern politics has turned into a kind of performance? How much of it is about signaling identity rather than actually solving problems?
People celebrate Juneteenth too, and non-Italians celebrate Columbus Day. And
I'm all for any holiday.
I'm a half Irish. Do I get half the day off on St. Patrick's Day?
But a lot of
I get half drunk.
Everybody gets drunk on St. Patrick's Day. That's a good point.
Did you have a question for the congressman there?
No, are you telling me you're black?
Yes.
You don't see color, right there?
That exchange lands because everyone recognizes the script. The phrasing is familiar, the balance is delicate, and the rules feel unwritten but enforced. We're supposed to acknowledge identity, but not lean too hard into it. Be inclusive, but constantly aware of categories. For a lot of people, that balancing act starts to feel performative and draining. That's the pressure Bill Maher keeps poking at. His argument, at its core, is a simple question. Does every conversation really need to begin with a checklist of identity markers? And if it does, what gets lost in the process? Because the more elite media circles center everything around that framework, the more disconnected they can sound from people who are focused on everyday concerns, competence, fairness, stability, and some baseline level of common sense. From there, Maher shifts the focus beyond Whoopi Goldberg and toward the larger culture that keeps producing these moments. That's where his critique sharpens. It's no longer about one comment or one show. It's about a pattern, a system of incentives that reward certain kinds of language and reactions, even when they oversimplify complicated realities.
Finally, new rule. Someone must tell the usual suspects on the far left that the saying is, when you're in a hole, stop digging, not keep digging. Talk about doubling down on what got you in the first place. Even the one concession I've heard a few people on the losing side offer that liberals should stop saying the Trump voters are stupid comes with a kind of unspoken parentheses. We know they are stupid, just don't say it. Yeah.
That's the part that really stings, the sense of arrogance. It's where a normal political disagreement starts to feel like outright cultural rejection, because people can pick up on tone. They know when they're being talked down to. That's one of the central points Bill Maher is making here. In his view, parts of the left haven't fully absorbed that lesson. They treat the issue like it's about messaging or branding, while he argues it's more about attitude. If people feel dismissed or disrespected, no amount of polished language is going to win them over. You can't build a broad coalition while projecting contempt for large groups of people. If you lose them, mock them, and then act surprised when they tune out, that's not a strategy. It's a disconnect. And from there, Maher leans into one of his sharper, more biting summaries, turning the critique into something that's not just political, but cultural, aimed at what he sees as the excesses and contradictions within modern left-wing discourse.
Yeah, I got bad news for you. They don't have a monopoly on stupid. You wear Queers for Palestine t-shirts and masks 2 years after the pandemic ended. And you can't define woman, I mean person who menstruates. You're the teachers' union education party, and you've turned schools and colleges into a joke. You just lost a crazy contest to an actual crazy person.
That's classic Bill Maher. Part roast, part dissection. Agree with him or not, you can see why it connects. His core argument is that the left often treats irrationality as a one-sided problem, something that only exists on the right, while overlooking its own blind spots and contradictions. That's the line he keeps crossing, the refusal to let his own side claim immunity from bad ideas. And that's why The View ends up in his sights. To him, it's more than just a talk show. It represents a broader tendency to resist self-correction. The tone stays confident. The certainty rarely wavers, even when the argument itself is shaky. The delivery doesn't change. Even if the substance should, he pushes that critique further by pointing to something more telling. It's not just critics or opponents raising these concerns. Increasingly, it's coming from within, voters and viewers who are starting to question the tone, the framing, and the lack of internal pushback. That's where the conversation shifts from media criticism to something deeper about political culture and how audiences are reacting to it.
We love to speak truth to power, and we always should, but you have completely lost the ability to speak truth to bullshit. The Democratic polling firm Blueprint told Democrats months ago that black voters, aka their supposedly liberal base, were more likely to find the president too liberal than too conservative. They also found that voters didn't just want Harris to distance herself from Biden, they wanted her to distance herself from what they believe the entire Democratic Party has become, a Portlandia sketch.
The Portlandia reference hits because people instantly recognize the type he's describing. Not liberal in the traditional practical sense, but something more performative, overly delicate, and so self-aware that it drifts away from real-world grounding. That's the image problem he's pointing at. And once that image solidifies, every moment like this, especially involving Whoopi Goldberg, starts to feel bigger than it actually is. It's no longer just one questionable take. It becomes evidence, in people's minds, of a broader pattern. That's why Bill Maher's critique resonates beyond just conservative audiences. He's also speaking to liberals and independents who feel frustrated being told that ideas they find unconvincing or exaggerated must be treated as morally superior or intellectually untouchable. And then he brings it back to The View itself, framing it not just as a platform for discussion, but as a symbol of that larger dynamic. In his view, it represents a style of discourse where certainty stays high, even when the argument doesn't fully hold up, and that's where his sharpest criticism really lands.
But isn't it interesting that it's called, I don't think they meant this when Barbara Walters invented it a long time ago, but it's The View.
Well,
that's the problem in America.
But
there is one view,
right, and
one
that's clearly
true opinion, and everybody else can go sit in the corner.
That's correct. I think that's not actually, you're right, the name raises questions, and certainly there's been some much covered internal politics on that show, but I do think that, there is space. Even that show does have space. When Whoopi said what she said, there was quick pushback from other panelists. They were like, oh, I don't know. Actually, I think that might not.
There's a contradiction baked right into the name The View itself. The View, singular and plural at the same time, implying many perspectives, many angles. But critics often see something more uniform in practice. a fairly consistent ideological direction, limited space for sustained disagreement, and a tone of strong emotional certainty that can sometimes come across as confidence rather than openness. In that framing, what's presented as multiple views can feel more like variations within a shared lane than genuinely competing perspectives. To be fair, moments of pushback do happen on the show, and that matters. But the reaction to those moments is revealing in itself. When dissent stands out as unusual or notable, it suggests viewers are used to a certain conversational rhythm. Even disagreement starts to feel like an event, rather than the norm. That's part of the larger point Bill Maher and his guests keep circling back to. The tone and structure of political conversation on platforms like this often feels predictable, and when it breaks pattern, it becomes more noticeable than it probably should. And then the frustration sharpens again, when commentary shifts into repeated emotional certainty, where strong language and sweeping statements replace slower, more careful reasoning. That's where the critique lands hardest, because it's not just about disagreement, it's about how disagreement itself is handled in the first place.
We can have platforms that have stuff on them that not everyone on that platform or who consumes stuff on that platform enjoys. And The View is a particularly weird place to do a cancellation.
It's called The View?
It's called The View. It's not called The Facts.
Yeah, but isn't it interesting that it's called, I don't think they meant this when Barbara Walters invented it a long time ago, but it's The View.
Well,
that's the problem in America.
But
there is one view,
right, and
one
that's clearly
true opinion, and everybody else can go sit in the corner.
That "it's not called the facts" line is where the controversy gets compressed into a single idea. Critics see The View less as a forum for competing arguments and more as a place where certain emotional framings get validated. And once a show operates that way, whether intentionally or not, it shifts from persuasion to performance. It stops trying to convince undecided viewers and starts reinforcing a shared sense of certainty among people who already agree. That can be effective for engagement, but it's not always effective for changing minds. In that framing, the criticism is less about whether opinions exist on the show, every talk show has them, and more about how those opinions are delivered, as settled moral conclusions rather than debatable positions. That's where viewers start to feel the gap between open discussion and pre-decided interpretation. That's also why Bill Maher's critique gained traction in the first place. He's not just reacting to one comparison or one segment involving Whoopi Goldberg. He's pointing at a broader media style where emotional intensity can sometimes be mistaken for insight, and disagreement gets treated as suspicion rather than engagement. From that perspective, the concern isn't that people are too sensitive for tough conversations, but that conversations can start to feel closed off even when they're presented as open. And when that perception sets in, audiences don't necessarily argue more, they just stop listening. That's the tension sitting underneath the whole debate.